Record button. We are on. Okay, so handing it over to you, John.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Rathgreb. And I thought I would start by giving my background story. Some of you have heard this, but not all of you have heard this. I never intended to be a Latin teacher. In fact, I never intended to be a teacher. Senior year of college, I went to the counseling center, and the counselor I met with said, describe your ideal job. So I listed a few things. And he said, have you ever thought of being a teacher? And I looked at him and said, God, no. But the more I thought about it, the more it kind of made sense. And then I ended up getting a job at my old high school, which was a Catholic school in Bergen County where you don't need to be certified. And much as those of you who went through teacher training could expect, it was the disaster you would think it was. So after that, I went to graduate school because I had it in my mind that, 2 years out of college, I was going to go back to graduate school and I was going to do something useful like study history. And not just study any history, study medieval history. So I graduate with a master's in medieval history, and in order to get my degree, I needed to have reading capabilities in Latin. And I hadn't had Latin since I was in high school. And even then, in 2 years, we covered maybe 20 chapters of Jenny's. So I took in 2 semesters of intensive Latin in graduate school, which basically is the same as 4 semesters for undergrads, and came out with like 10 credits. And my intention was to be a social studies teacher. Again, no teacher training. So I applied to Catholic schools and I ended up getting a job at Mars Catholic to teach social studies. However, like most administrators, the administration of this particular school wasn't interested really in my capabilities as much as me filling a slot that they had. So in addition to teaching for social studies, they also wanted me to teach a freshman English class. And I was in no way qualified to teach a freshman English class. So the very first day of school, when the faculty got together, the vice principal made an announcement asking if anybody knew of a Latin teacher because they were absolutely desperate because their Latin teacher had retired in June and they hadn't found anybody to replace her yet. And Latin was required for all the freshmen. So I got to thinking, well, maybe I can get rid of this English class and take up a Latin class because I could certainly teach a Latin 1 class. So I went to the assistant principal and I proposed the idea to her, and she kind of looked at me and said, I don't know. She says, I'll have to think about it. So the second day for the faculty, I come in and every nun that I encountered kept coming up to me and congratulating me. And I was like, why are you congratulating me? Well, you're the new Latin teacher. So I went to the vice principal and I said, what's this? She said, yeah, you're the closest that we have. She says, not even the priests know Latin anymore. So you're all we have. And she says, you'll learn as you go along. And I guarantee you, because this was like Thursday before Labor Day, she says, by the time we come back from Labor Day, I will have somebody to replace you in social studies. So sure enough, she was right. And I began teaching Latin. And, it was one of those quirks of fate that kind of happened to you. And it was a good thing because I think I would have been miserable as a social studies teacher, but I've had a great time teaching Latin. And I spent my 6 years in Catholic school getting my certification in social studies, then psychology, and then finally going to Montclair to take the rest of the classes I needed to get certified in Latin. The kicker was the second year that I was teaching Latin, just as I was starting to get my feet under me, the assistant principal announces that all senior level language classes would be AP that next year. So suddenly I had to teach AP without any training. And I had maybe 6 weeks of Virgil in that accelerated Latin class. So it's been an adventure. And I've spent a great deal of time over the past 30 years in accumulating knowledge to become a teacher that I hope my students found effective. One of the vehicles that was very useful to me has been meetings like this. I became associated with New Jersey Classical pretty early on in my career. Just a random mailer that came to the school, and they were announcing their fall meeting, and so I went to see what was going on. And I learned stuff that I wouldn't expect learning, not only through presentations, but sitting at lunch or having coffee with other Latin teachers, and you share ideas and you talk about how you handle different things. And we used to have teacher exchanges, where everybody would bring some sort of materials, and you come back with reams of paper, which was invaluable to me. ACL was another great resource. Going to Rome on the Edna White Rome Scholarship was absolutely invaluable to me, completely changed how I taught. So that's kind of my plug for being part of professional organizations. Is it really can help you grow, particularly if you are a singleton and you have nobody else to talk with about these things. It really is nice to have that. So here I am now, 31 years later, and on the verge of retirement. And I've just been kind of thinking a lot in the last couple of months about my career. And I approached Kathy because there are certain assignments, projects, whatever we want to call them, that I've developed that I think are really useful, and I just wanted to kind of throw out there to you to use on your own. If this is based off of an idea that somebody shared during a teacher exchange and I stole it, well, I apologize. You can take credit for it. Funny thing is that when we were preparing for this year, and I'm like racking my brains on how to present information to my students and what sort of projects I could get them to do virtually, I went through files and I pulled out a file which asked them to write about themselves, how they used to be and how they are now, to review imperfect and present tense. And when I looked at the name on the bottom of the sheet, it was Janice Stavenick, to those of you who remember, who, as it turned out, was teaching at William Annan Middle School at the time. And coincidentally, I've ended up taking her place when she retired. So it's a very small world that we travel in, which is kind of nice. So let's get to some of the activities. I'm going to share my screen. I'm also, actually, let me put that in chat first. I have a tiny URL code that I'm going to put in chat. So if you want to look at it on your own, as opposed to with the shared screen, you can. This is in a Google Doc, so as long as you have the link, you can access this at any time. All right, so in the last couple of years, my district has really made a push on social emotional learning and trying to reduce the stress on kids. There's been numerous presentations done by students about how much stress that they're under. And while I can appreciate this, I also kind of wonder what's changed. I look at what they do. I look at what I used to do in high school, and I don't think that they have any more responsibilities than I did when I was in high school. And we all had stress when we were students, so I don't know why they expect that they shouldn't have stress. But I'm digressing on that one. So the district has brought in a couple of years ago a pedagogical guru by the name of Rick Wormley, who's big on this social emotional learning. And one of the things that he was talking about was how we need to move away in our grading from including anything in the grades that doesn't reflect the student's academic responsibilities. So he advocates things like, don't take off points because something is late. He says if you're trying to teach responsibility to a student, you should have a separate way of reporting that rather than influencing their academic grade. Their academic grade should reflect solely what they know. So, I began thinking about some of the things that he said in this presentation and some of the things my district had wanted us to do in terms of reducing stress. And I came up with this first activity, this first page that I'm showing to you, which is homework checklists. So what I did is I began at the end of the year. So it's kind of like in May that I began introducing it. I introduced it to one class only. And it was my 8th grade, which I've taught dozens of times. So I know the curriculum inside out. I know what assignments I usually give and how to approach it. So I just kind of went through and listed for the kids all the assignments that they were going to have by the end of the unit. And I gave them this checklist. And I said, you don't have to do all of the assignments. You just have to do at least the minimum. So as you can see, there are 3 vocabulary assignments that I would be giving them. They had to do at least 2 of them. Here, this was a grammar assignment, so there are 6, and I said that they had to do a minimum of 4. And I told them, I'm still, I'm going to assign it a particular night for homework, and I expect it to be completed the next day in class. Once we go over it, you can't get credit for this. So what I do is, when I check the homework, I tell the kids, take out your checklist, take out your homework. While they're doing their due now, I walk up and down the aisles and I put my initials on next to the assignment. So by the end of the unit, I will simply just collect this from them and see that they have done the minimum. And so if they have completed the minimum number of requirements, they get a 2. So I grade my homework simply on 0, 1, or 2. So rather than grading each individual assignment, so I could have a dozen homework grades for a unit. Here now they're only getting 1. And I kind of asked the class for feedback, and generally it was very positive because they could kind of plan out when they were going to do certain activities. So if, for example, they knew that they had a big band concert one night and they weren't going to be able to do their homework, they would plan to have other homeworks done either before or after that, so they would still get full credit for their homework. Interesting thing about this was I overheard 2 students talking, and they didn't really know I was listening. And one of them was like my brightest kid in the class. And the other kid turned to him and said, "You didn't do your homework?" And the other kid said, "No, it was to conjugate decline nouns in the fourth declension. I don't need to do that. I know the endings." And when I listened to him, I thought, that made perfect sense, because the whole purpose of having them decline nouns is just simply to get the endings in their heads. And if they already know them, why does the kid need to waste his time? He could do other things for his homework. And I thought, this is brilliant because it puts the onus on the kid. Now they're managing their own learning, and they know what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done. So I stuck with it. Now, of course, we have the overachievers who immediately said, well, what if I want to do them all? There's no incentive. So I have an extra credit program in class where I would hand out, tokens as extra credit points if they win a game or something. So I just said, okay, here's the deal. If you complete all the assignments, you get 2 extra credit points for the marking for the unit. If you complete at least 1 additional assignment, I'll give you 1 extra credit point. And that seemed to work for the kids. I would have continued doing it this year, except that, obviously things are way different now. But I really do like this, and I just throw it out there for you to consider as a way of taking some of the pressure off the kids, but still having them do their work. Because, as you can see, many of the assignments kind of overlap in what I'm expecting them to practice. So again, as long as they do one of a particular thing, and if a unit is broken up into different components, I might have different categories and say, okay, you need to do 3 of these and 3 of these. All right, so that's the homework checklist. Now, in combination with this, you'll notice it says here, vocab choice board. This was something that came up a couple of years ago where our district was really pushing this idea of choice boards. And, I don't know about you, but I've spent 30 years trying to find ways to get kids to study vocabulary with varying degrees of success. So one of the things that I've relied on in the last couple of years is this vocabulary choice board, which again, I give to them at the beginning of the unit with their vocabulary list, and they get to choose which activity they would like to do. And so, on the choice board, there tend to be 9 activities. And when I say do one, they can do whichever one they want. And then as long as they show me the proof, I'll give them credit on their checklist. Once you've created the first vocabulary choice board, I just kind of cut and pasted and continued for each chapter after that. I might make little tweaks to it. What I did find is as I moved this into the high school, because again, I pilot everything in my 8th grade class. As I moved this into my high school classes, I got rid of the grid and I just simply listed the activities under the vocabulary on the vocabulary list. So that way I wasn't tied to doing 9 activities. Sometimes I would just assign them 6. They seem to like it. Particularly there are kids who will always do flashcards. There are kids whose go-to is to go to Quizlet. And you know what? As long as they're doing something, I figure it's worthwhile. All right, let's go on to the next one. Now, in making up for the deficit that I had as not being an education major when I entered teaching, and as I progress up the salary guide, I continue to take classes in education. And as a little aside, I'm going to do a little plug here. I took a lot of classes through an organization called the Regional Training Center. The years ago, they used to send mailers to everybody in schools. I haven't seen them in a long time. They offer credit through, or they used to offer credit through the College of New Jersey, and they have remote sites all over the state. I mean, one class I took literally a mile from my house. And these classes were extremely useful because every class has as its project something that you can actually use in your classroom when you go back to your classroom. And they're done, like I used to take them over the summer, so they were done over the course of 2 weeks. You went 3 full days 1 week, 2 full days the next week. You wrote your paper, did your project, you were done, and you got credit. Which brings me to a piece of advice that my supervisor and a couple of veteran teachers gave to me when I first came into public school, that I'm going to pass along to some of the younger teachers. It's to your benefit to max out on the salary guide as early as you can, because that just gives you more years to make more money. And so that's what I had done. I ended up with, when I stopped taking classes, I think I had 51 credits above my master's degree. So I'm at the top of the guide in my current district, and you know what? I'm making okay money. So one of the classes I took was a class on assessment, because I mean, by the time I got to like 10 years into this, I was getting kind of bored with how I was making tests. So as a result of this assessment class, I came up with this format for a group test. I mean, I don't know how many of you, you walk into class and the kids say to you, "Oh, can we have a group test?" without them really understanding what a group test involved. They just want to get answers from each other. But I came up with this, and this was a first example that I came up with. So this is on a unit on perfect passive participles. And in Ecce Romani, it happens to coincide with them teaching the food unit. So we spent a lot of time talking about food. So I figured it makes a good combination to bring food in with participles, because, as you can see from the recipe that I've created here, you can use perfect passive participles. So what I asked the kids to do then is I divided this task up into 2 parts. There's an individual part, and then there's a group part. So in part 1, they are supposed to just form the participle to show me that they understand that you go to the 4th principal part and you put it down there. Okay, nothing beyond that. And for that, I gave them some points. Then in part 2, I took it one step further, where they had to figure out the noun that the participle was modifying and put the noun in its proper form in Latin and give me the participle. So actually do some writing. Then that's where they stopped. Okay, and I would tell them that once you're done with part 2 and we move on to part 3, you cannot go and change an answer in parts 1 or 2. Part 3, I then divide them up into groups where they can then discuss their answers. And they can make any changes that they want to what they did in part 2, but they have to put it in part 3. And then finally, the last thing that they would do is, if they have time remaining, they would continue to translate the rest of the recipe into Latin. And for my higher achieving kids, they did this no problem. They finished translating the entire paragraph by the end of the period. And I would say to them when I turned the test back to them, I'm like, if I had just handed you this recipe and asked you to translate this into Latin, you all would have freaked out. But you did exactly that, and you did a good job doing it. Now, as you can see, for each recipe, I give them all the vocabulary that they need. They don't have to look anything up. And the first time that I gave this type of a test to my Latin 2 kids, I was completely blown away, because once they moved into a group, so this is 15 minutes into the class, they now had approximately a half hour to complete parts 3 and 4. I listened to these kids arguing about perfect passive participles for 30 minutes. When would you ever think that your kids would spend time heatedly talking about perfect passive participles? Now, the other thing that I do in terms of this is I have like 7 recipes that I've developed. So in any given class, I'll divide the kids up into 4 or 5 groups, and each group has a different recipe. So I tell them when they move into part 3, I'm like, you can be as loud as you want, because you're not going to give the answer to anybody else. The other thing that I did with this particular test, which fit in with all the districts that I've been with, their push towards differentiation. I've made the groups homogeneous, so that, you know, there's not one smart kid that everybody else is copying the answers off of. And depending upon the ability level of the group, I would give them I give them opportunities to ask questions. So the lower achieving groups would have 3 questions they could ask. And what I would do is I'd give them bingo chips to indicate questions. And the higher achieving groups would only get 1 question they could ask. And so as I go around and monitor, you know, I hear them struggling with something. So I'll just hold out my hand and say, you need to ask me a question. And in that case, I usually ask them the question. But so like in the case of this particular assignment, when they're translating the rest of the paragraph, they all completely lose sight of the fact that the verbs are imperatives and how to form the imperatives. So I ask them to hand over the chips so that I can remind them how to form an imperative. And then they go on their merry way. The kids like this test. Sometimes they even ask for this format. I've gotten to the point where I give them 1 test like this a year. So this is my Latin 2. I've used this even in 6th grade. In fact, I just finished chapter 4 of Ecce, where we teach them the accusative case and direct object. And that's usually where I give them this format of a test. And even 6th graders do really well on this format. And it's a great way for them to show me a difference between subjects and direct objects. I use it for noun adjective agreement when I teach 3rd declension adjectives to 8th grade. So it's really quite adaptable. You know, you could think of a variety of different topics that you could do this on. I think I've also used it on place and time constructions. Any questions on that?
What grade level is this for again?
The test that is in the document is for Latin 2. But I've used this, again, I've used this from introductory students up through advanced students.
I have a question.
Yeah.
As a teacher, is homework mandatory to hand out?
Well, that's something that has actually changed over time. And the answer is currently in my district, no.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, we went, this, when you stop to, those of you who are retired or been in teaching for a long time, when you stop and think about how things have changed, this is probably one of the things that's changed. It used to be you had to give homework every night to kids. Now it got to a point where you couldn't give homework over long vacations. Then suddenly it became you couldn't give homework over the weekends. Then you couldn't give homework on nights that there was a big band concert or the show was going on or there was a football game or whatever. So it's the point where I just kind of throw up my hands and say whatever. Yeah. All right. This next item is a project that I offered to my Latin 2 students. It's an advertising project. Again, because Ecce Romani is really big on doing food in the second level book, we spend a lot of time talking about food. I talk about garum to them. And then I give them this assignment, and it coincides very nicely with the unit on comparison of adjectives and adverbs, which is something that you would use all the time in an assignment. So, I tell them that they have to come up with an ad campaign for this brand of garum to try to improve sales in Rome. And that it has to be a coordinated campaign where they need to do either all have to do a print ad, or I guess now I have to say, an internet pop-up window or something like that. And they have to do either a jingle that they record or a commercial that they make. Used to be, I could say you could do a storyboard, but nobody ever bothers with that because making videos has become so easy that they all decide to make videos. You can see I labeled the brand of garum Putris piscis. And you'd be really surprised at how few kids ask me if it's okay to change the name. I'm like, yeah, who wants rotten fish as a brand that you want to buy? So go ahead, change it to whatever you want. So it's a writing project. They work in groups on this whole thing. You will see, so the rubric here that I asked them to do is we're focusing on comparison of adjectives and adverbs. I've also used this in past years as an end of semester assignment, because when I was able to move a little faster through the curriculum, I usually was at this point by the end of the first semester. So then I asked them to put in all the stuff that we've learned. And depending upon the level, and this was for my honors class the last time, I still keep that in. If this were my regular Latin 2 classes, I would just focus on comparison of adjectives and adverbs. So they had to, include relative clauses, participles, passive infinitives, passive verbs, demonstratives. Okay, and not like one of each, but a certain number, so to show that they can fit it all in. And so these are the requirements, and 5 times 4 equals 20, which would give them an A. And again, they spend a lot of time working on this, and they do very well with this. I don't tend to keep student projects, mostly because I don't have the room. But I will tell you, when I first came up with this back in the 90s, a very common ad campaign was Habes ne garum. Because Got Milk was real popular at the time. Now, it kind of varies, but I did happen to find one that a kid made 2 years ago when I made this, and that is in this picture here. Now, there are grammatical errors here, but the drawing is exceptional because the student who did this is a really talented artist. But it just kind of gives you an idea of what the kids are capable of. Another project that sticks in my mind is, about 10, 12 years ago, kids did a video where the theme song was, I think it's Britney Spears, Genie in a Bottle. And they kind of wrote their Latin lyrics to that, and it was garum in a bottle. It was really quite clever. And the if you look at the beginning of the description, I tell them on the day that it's due, okay, the owner of the company, who is me sometimes, is coming in to listen to your proposals, and that he or she will decide who they're going to award their contract to, and as an incentive, each person in that group will get 3 extra credit chips. So, in a pinch, it's me. Other times I like to ask my supervisor to come in and be the company owner. I've had vice principals come in. It's a good way to kind of get administration into your class to see what kind of things that you do. Any questions on this? Okay.
No, but it was awesome. Thanks.
Thanks, Jen. The thing is, I haven't decided whether I'm going to do it this year or not with my Latin 2s, just because of the whole quarantine thing and who's virtual and who's in the class. It's the logistics make it a little bit harder. When I came into Basking Ridge, they had a real big push on technology. I think I probably learned more about technology in this district than I had in my previous 2 districts. And of course, in the past 10 years, technology has changed dramatically. But one of the professional development classes I took was on the use of technology, and the assistant superintendent who was leading it presented this idea of using QR codes and creating what I've called a QR code treasure hunt. So I first created this using mythology. And the way it's supposed to work is that you create a series of questions and you embed them in QR codes that you're supposed to print out and like tape around the building. So the kids literally have to go on a scavenger hunt. So the idea would be that, I would hang these up in remote spots around the building, and I tell the kids that as you go through the course of your day, if you see one, take out your smartphone and scan the QR code, get the question, and then talk to your group and answer the question. And I first started it this way. I got permission from the assistant principal to do this with my 6th graders. And the first day that it was out, they were going crazy. They loved this idea, especially that they were able to use their phones. Well, by the 2nd day, I had gotten an email from the principal saying, no, you cannot do this. They are not allowed to use their cell phones in school. So yeah, I know, good idea shot to hell by an administrator. Like, that's something new. So what I did is I've modified this, and I've reserved large spaces. So my go-to is to reserve the auditorium. And before school starts, I will go into the auditorium and I will pin up these QR codes all over the auditorium. Sometimes in plain sight, sometimes it's like under a seat, so the kids have to go searching for it. And I'll bring them all in and I'll explain the assignment to them. And then I'll set them loose going around the auditorium. So they're in one confined space. And again, it's a lot of fun to watch these kids just rushing around the auditorium. I found one. I'm like, from a strategic point of view, you might want to be a little more subtle about this and just say to your friends, hey, look, here's one here. Quickly take a picture so nobody else sees it. So what they do is they collect these questions, and then they sit down with their group and they answer the questions. And I collect the answer sheets at the end of the period. It's not a graded assignment. I just simply tell them that the group that has the most number of correct answers, everybody will get extra credit chips, which is enough for them. And so this one is on mythology. As I begin to introduce the unit on the gods and goddesses, it's kind of a way for me to see what the kids already know and what they have to look up and how good they are at looking things up. So as I then teach them the unit, I will purposely go through and answer these questions. So I don't remember where they put the question. No. So there's one of the QR codes that I would paste up around school. So you could scan it, it'll take you to the question. Excuse me for a moment. I'm running out of power here. But there's anywhere from like, I think for little kids, 10 questions is more than enough for a period. But again, because it's something different, because it gets them out of the classroom, it makes them excited to be in class. And so what I've done is I've created a version of this for each of the 3 years that they're in middle school. So they do mythology for 6th grade. For 7th grade, I take them in early in the year. By like the 3rd day of school, we're in the auditorium, and all the questions are geared towards all the grammar that we learned in 6th grade to kind of get them thinking about it all at once. And so then beginning the next day, I can go back and review with them, and they haven't had the fog of the summer interfering with their recall of this information. For 8th grade, I use it in a similar way to 6th graders as an introduction to the unit. I teach them a unit just after New Year's on the Roman calendar. And so I give them questions that reflect the history of the calendar that they have to, I know they won't know the answer, so they have to do research on the internet. And again, as I teach them the history of the calendar, I will touch upon the questions that I've asked them. Any questions? Now, I kind of thought that this particular assignment, it seemed really innovative when I first did it about 10 years ago. And at that point, the assistant super was saying, QR codes are going to become the new thing. And QR codes never really caught on. In fact, it was always a challenge for the kids because you'd have to tell them to make sure they downloaded a QR code reader on their phones before they came to class. What I have been finding in the last 2 or 3 years is that it's a little bit easier since QR code readers are embedded as part of the cameras on phones now, so it's not an issue for kids. They may have never seen them and know what to do with them, but that's their problem, at least I can say that I've taught them some technology. All right. So, these are the questions that I would ask them. So it might not be stuff that they would exactly have gotten out of Percy Jackson, because if you teach little kids, they know all the mythology now because they've all read Percy Jackson. And I have to remind them that that's really good, but keep in mind that Percy Jackson often changes mythology to suit the author's purpose. All right. This next activity is a project that I do in 8th grade. Ecce Romani, very late in the Latin 1 book, finally talks about the city of Rome. Personally, I would prefer it much earlier, but we know that the Corneliuses are down their summer house down and along the Bay of Naples, and they spend forever stuck in a ditch. In fact, I joke with my 7th graders and my 8th graders. We just finished a chapter where they just got out of the ditch in 8th grade. And I said to the kids, I'm like, I told you a year ago in January, when they fell in the ditch, it was going to be a year before they got out. And you didn't believe me. And I said, nobody except somebody who studies from Ecce Romani understands the phrase, life's a ditch. All right, so anyway, I digress. So to try to get them to understand some of the places of Rome, other than me just standing up there and lecturing to them, which I could do, but I see their eyes glaze over because they're not as excited at stuff as I am. I came up with this idea of having them create a tour. Now that's not very innovative because I know lots of us do that sort of thing. And this is one of those projects that has evolved over time as technology has evolved. And it used to be they had to create a pamphlet. Then I had them create a PowerPoint which used hyperlinks that actually demonstrated the tour of Rome. And in the past 6 or 7 years, the media center specialist at the middle school came across a beta application for Google Earth called Tour Builder. which kind of did the same thing that PowerPoints did, but it uses the map feature of Google Earth. And I'll show you an example in a second. So I've been relying on that in the last 5 or 6 years. So what they have to do is they have to create a tour of 3 sites of Rome. One is from the A list site, one is from the B list sites, and then one can be from either one. This is to prevent everybody from doing the Colosseum all the time. And then what they have to do is they have to do some research and they have to tell me about it. And so these are some of the questions that they have to answer. When was the structure built? Who built it? What was it used for? Give me an example of an outstanding architectural feature. And for those of you who've been on the American Academy Summer Program, you will notice that the materials we get from that program are very useful in answering a lot of these questions. In fact, that was the impetus for creating this assignment in this way, was to give myself the opportunity to share with the kids what I learned in Rome. And then they need to include several pictures. So let me switch windows here. I don't think I need to reshare here. So do we see a change in the screen? Okay. And where's Jonathan's? So this is an example of a project a kid did a couple of years ago. I did not do this last year because we were on quarantine at the time, and there was too much else going on. So here is where they store their pictures. Underneath, they can put some text, so he gives you an idea of what he's going to be doing in this. And then he's dropped a pin in each of the 3 sites that he's going to be using on the map. Now, I used to just give them a blank map of Rome or require them to get a blank map of Rome and have them find the spots. But you know what? If Google Earth is going to label it for them, I'm okay with that. At least this way, they still get to see the shape of the building and get some exposure to the city. So his first one was a Pantheon, and you can see that it takes you a closer bird's eye view of it. He's included 3 different pictures with his description, and then he's told me some information about it. And I asked them to simply put internal citations for wherever they got the information. I have lots of books available for them. I have several copies of the Blue Guide that I have for the kids to use, but as no doubt you all experienced, they don't touch books anymore. We're lucky they even open up the internet to get information. And of course, they scream bloody murder as soon as you say no Wikipedia. Yeah, as somebody put in the chat, I did notice this when I first went back to Tour Builder. They said they're shutting this down in July of 2021. However, when you click to learn more, they're not so much shutting it down as incorporating these features into Google Earth itself. So you'll just be going to Google Earth to do this. Because I'm retiring, I'm going to get in under the wire and still be able to do Tour Builder one more time. So then again, if I go to the next site, it takes me to there. So there's his pictures of the Colosseum, his description of the Colosseum. And then finally, he chose as his 3rd site, the Temple of Vesta. Which I will tell you, I think it's important to put it on there, but the Temple of Vesta is a pain in the neck because all the internet sources always give them pictures of the Temple of Hercules and Victus. And it's like, and I have to keep telling kids over and over again, no, it's mislabeled. They keep mislabeling this for whatever reason. Any questions about this particular assignment? All right, let me go back to my doc. Oh, now here's what I would use to grade this particular assignment. If you compare how I grade this with, say, how I grade the Garum project, it's very different. the way the Garum project is set up, the rubric in the Garum project is how I was first exposed to rubrics, having 5, 3, and 1. Over time, I find I have less and less patience for that format, especially when I read descriptions of other teachers' rubrics where it says is highly reliable, is mostly reliable, is somewhat reliable, is a little bit reliable. I'm like, I can't distinguish between those different gradations. If it just leaves me open for arguments with kids, because I can't say you didn't include this, this, and this. If I say you're missing these 3 items, the kid can't argue with me. If I'm saying, well, you kind of got it, but I didn't really like the way it was done, the kid can argue. So what I've simply gone to is more or less a checklist. So you can see that for each of the 3 sites that the kids had to do, it's simply a yes or no. Do you have these things? Yes. All right, then you get points for it. If you don't, then you don't get a point. And I'm much happier doing rubrics in this particular way. So for the Roman tour project, I would probably give them 3 days of research in class over the course of maybe 2 weeks. And I'd give them anywhere from 2 to 2.5 weeks for the project to be due. Again, going with the kinder and gentler approach to grading for students, I've completely given up the idea of ever marking a kid down for turning in something late. Generally it's just they send them an email saying, get this in, I need to get it graded. What I've actually been doing this year in situations like that, because we all know it's always the same kids who are always late or have unfinished products. I send the kid an email to their school email account, but I CC the parent on it. And that usually gets some sort of response from either the parent or the kid. All right.
John, could I ask a question about grading?
Sure.
I was just wondering, based on your experience, I mean, a lot of your assignments are really cool, and I find that, well, I usually teach in overage because I'm also a social studies teacher. Excuse me. And I was just wondering, sometimes I feel like I'm disincentivized from giving more elaborate projects or assignments because I don't know how I can find the time to grade them. I was just wondering, to give them the appropriate level of feedback, because as you know, like grading individual items for accuracy can be really quite time consuming. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about what kinds of trade-offs you've made in the way that you approach grading assignments, especially when you have a lot of students.
Well, that's kind of why I've gravitated towards the checklist in terms of grading assignments, because it's very quick to simply look, do they have it or don't they, as opposed to me having to read and make an assessment. And I will tell you honestly that I used to have a writing component to a lot of the projects that I did, but as I've moved through the years, I find I have less patience for the writing that kids turn in. They don't put the effort into it, and the stuff that they write is just junk. So I've kind of stayed away from that because that is time consuming. Hope that answers your question. This next one, Bobby, I think you'll like this because it kind of ties into one of your interests. Eke Ramani talks very briefly about the tombs along the road that they see as they start to enter the city. And so what I had found a number of years ago was a website that had several actual Roman tombstones and kind of talked about the formula and the abbreviations. And one of the things that I've done over the past couple of years for 8th grade in particular is I've tried to give them some more authentic Latin that they can actually manage. And I find that tombstone inscriptions is something that they can actually handle. So in addition to the stuff I've gotten from the website, it seems like every time I go on vacation someplace where the Romans had some sort of foothold, I end up finding tombstones, and I end up taking pictures of the tombstones and bring them back and working through them with the kids. So for example, here is and you can enlarge this on your own, I guess. But here is a tombstone that was found in one of the emperor's palaces, the emperor's palace in Vienna. So, you know, the Emperor Franz Joseph. This was a whole bunch of tombstones just lining the stairwell. So I took a picture of it, and for the kids' purpose, in case they can't make out the lettering, I gave them what's written on the tombstone. And so we've practiced a number of these, and to kind of help them out, we did a station activity where I would set up 4, 5, 6 different copies of tombstones. They would have this particular worksheet, and working with their group, they'd wander from station to station and they'd answer the questions and pull out what kind of information that they can. And they actually get pretty good at this by the end. So what I then do as like a culminating activity for this is I have them create a tombstone on their own, not their own tombstone. So I give them these 5 famous individuals, and I said, you need to do a little bit of research to get some information, and then you need to create a tombstone in which you pull at least 3 elements from the formula. And then you need to make this tombstone. And generally it's on a piece of paper, but I'm like, you know, when you carve it, that means you can't type, you can't use computer fonts. You have to do this by hand, and it needs to be careful enough so that you could show that you've paid enough respect to the deceased to pay the money to get a decent stone carver who can spell things correctly and have letters of even sizes, and make sure that they can be seen from a distance so that everybody knows how good you are. And so they turn them in. And, you know, generally, you know, they always choose the DM for Dies Manibus. The name counts as one of them. And then generally it's, you know, something important that they did in their life. And I said, you know, you want to show respect, but, you know, consider yourself an heir to this person, and you don't want to spend all their money that they've given to you. So you don't want a lot of text, you want as little as possible. So for example, for Gaius Marius, I kind of just pushed them into listing Consul Septies, Consul 7 times, that's it. They said, shouldn't I put something like he reformed the army? I'm like, no, why waste your money? He was Consul 7 times, move on. And then I grade them on, and I hang these around the room. So they generally have a good time with this. In fact, some of them have too good of a time with it. I didn't show you here, but about 3 or 4 years ago, 3 boys came up to me and handed me my own tombstone. And, you know, yeah, it kind of sounds a little creepy, but it was actually pretty funny, especially when they said born 1987. I'm like, you know what, I'll take it. And what did they say? As my epitaph, they wrote in, sometimes I feel like I'm already dead. And I just looked at them like, what? And they were like, no, I swear, you said this about 3 weeks ago in class. And I stopped and I thought, and I'm like, yeah, it was the middle of winter. So yeah, I guess I did kind of say that. So, you know, they're listening when you think they're not listening. But it was also very nice because they said, father to some, teacher to all, I think was the expression that they used. So it was cute. And then they made me with a bow tie and googly eye. So I've kept that. That's in my file someplace. Again, I'm not sure I'm gonna do this or not this year. Again, just simply because, well, not only cost of time, but I'm just not sure how I'm going to have them do it. You know, you really can't have them draw anymore. I'm not supposed to be collecting papers from them, and doing it on Google just doesn't seem to have the same effect in my mind. So we'll see. All right, that's tombstones. So let me skip this for a minute. I'll come back to that in a second. We all have the dilemma of how to ease them back into school at the beginning of each year. And I hate that, trying to figure out what I'm going to do with them, particularly like on that half day. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't say half day. Look at that first full day back. And it's like, why not just make it a half day? Why do we have to see these kids for 40 minutes? I have nothing to say to them. They don't want to learn just yet. They're busy seeing their friends. So where is it? There it is. Okay. So I came up with this idea a few years ago of having them figure out the Latin names for movies. So I spend, usually a couple of days at the end of August searching the web to see what movies were popular that particular summer and creating this worksheet. So, if the Latin's a little bit off, that's my fault. It's kind of hard to figure out what to do with some of these things. Like for example, in this year, Pistrix, was the movie The Meg. I don't know. I never saw it. For the high school kids, it's hard to begin with, but for the middle school kids, it's even worse because there's certain movies that I won't have them talk about, or I'll have to have like Secret Life of Pets 2. But they generally have a good time with this. It takes about 10 or 15 minutes of the class, and it also, if I have extra time, it allows me to have a conversation with them in Latin, asking them, did they see any movies over the summer? And if they say yes, I'll ask which one, and I'll say, in Latin again, did you like it? So at least it gets them to start using language and start thinking in terms of the language. So in connection with that, again, this goes back to 8th grade. One of the earliest assignments I have them do within the first week is the traditional essay of what I did this summer. And it's now changed into being a written paragraph to being a PowerPoint where or I should say a slideshow, where they have to include pictures of themselves doing something over the course of the summer. And they have the advantage of either doing one particular trip that they went on, or if they didn't do anything special, they could just do 5 random events. The point is that they need to be creating 5 sentences. They need to use a minimum of 5 verbs. Now, I have an ulterior motive for this that the kids aren't aware of. This is my initial assessment for my SGO, because one of my SGOs for 8th grade has to do with them using the perfect tense. Because when they begin 8th grade, they don't have the perfect tense yet. They don't get that until December. So all they have is the imperfect tense. So when they talk about past events, they're going to use the imperfect. And then when they come back from Christmas, I have them do the same assignment, telling me what they did over Christmas. This time they have the perfect tense. And so basically what I'm asking them to do, my SGO, is to show me that they understand the difference in the use of the perfect versus the imperfect. And, some years are better than others. And, the bright kids really pick this up. The kids who are struggling don't understand the difference so much. But you know what? It satisfies my supervisor, and it doesn't freak the kids out at the beginning of the year because I'm giving them a quiz on material they've never had before. So I'm going to show you what I showed my kids this year, because I always create one as a model for them. So here's part of my slideshow. No big trips, just simply puttering around the house. The one thing that always amazes me when I'm getting the kids to write in Latin, I keep telling the 8th graders, I'm like, you're at an eighth grade reading and writing level in English, but in Latin, you're at a 1st grade level. And you need to think about the types of things you used to read as a 1st grader. Your sentences should be short and simple. And yet, they get into like Ciceronian paragraphs in English and expect to be able to translate them into Latin. And I'm like, no, don't. All right, so somebody asked about what my middle school program looks like. So we have Latin 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. The kids choose Latin in 6th grade, and they have to stick with it through 8th grade. They can't change. We use Ecce Romani, and we use the Ecce Romani 1 book to cover all 3 years. And they basically cover about 8 chapters a year. So 6th grade, they learn how to decline nouns of the first 3 declensions. They learn the present tense of verbs. They learn noun adjective agreement initially. 7th grade, they also get nominative and accusative cases. 7th grade, they get genitives and ablative cases. They get the imperfect tense. We get neuter nouns. We also get more noun adjective agreement. And then 8th grade, we get the remaining verb tenses, 4th and 5th conjugation, 3rd declension adjectives. I think that's it. Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. Because this is what they would normally do in 1 year of high school Latin. There's a lot of padding that needs to be done to stretch this over 3 years. But that's actually a good thing because it gives me the ability to play around with these types of activities. If I were teaching this at high school, I wouldn't be able to do any of this stuff. And quite frankly, this is the fun stuff. All right, let me go back. Okay, yeah. Yeah, our Latin 2, because of where I'm able to get them over the course of the 3 years, we're able to start with the Latin 2 book. So that's chapter 28 in Ecce. All right. Any questions on, oh, yeah, any questions on the what I did for the summer? It's also important to give them vocabulary. It just solves a lot of questions. The other thing I like about doing these types of writing activities is it gives the kids exposure to using a dictionary. Because, you know, if they're only in the textbook, they never have any experience in what the dictionary is going to look like. They're just used to the glossary of the book, which, you know, it's easy to find words in the glossary. It's not so easy to find them in the dictionary. Now, one of the things that I use for padding is mythology. And so what I designed in my 8th grade class is mythology for that whole year is the Trojan War. And I divided it up into 3 parts. The first part, which I just covered with my students, is the lead up to the war itself. The second part is basically a synopsis of the Iliad through the destruction of Troy. And then the third part, which they'll get late in the spring, is the Odyssey, or summary of the Odyssey. And there's kind of an ulterior motive to that, because what that allows me to do is finish up the summary of the Odyssey somewhere in early June, like 2 weeks before school. So then that last week of school, when they're busy with graduation practice and I'm trying to get grades done, we end up watching the Odyssey miniseries with Armand Desante from back in the 90s. And that keeps them entertained. One of the things that I use to teach is this website called War with Troy. If some of you recall, back at ACL, when it was in Buffalo, so whatever year that was in the early 2000s, they had as one of the entertainment that night, these 2 British guys who got up there and told stories. And they told the section of the Iliad. I loved how they did it so much that I bought their CD from them. And so I used that for quite a number of years. And then a few years ago, one of my kids came in and says, you know, I found it on the internet, which is great because I no longer have CD players in school. So now I use this website. And I highly recommend it. I'm not going to play anything for you now, but they are really great at telling stories. And one of the things I like about it is it really gives the kids the idea of how these stories actually developed by, you know, people just telling them around the fire at night, you know, and devices they use to try to remember it. I just refer to this simply as the British guys. So I say to the kids, okay, so we're going to let the British guys tell this. And I don't like, you know, they take some liberties with the stories. So, you know, at certain points, I will shut them off and I will tell them the version that I want them to know. And if they listen to it on their own and say, well, you know, that they say it's something different, I said, well, you have to remember, there's lots of different versions of these stories floating around. I'm just trying not to confuse you. But, you know, it's the point where I've got, you know, all the kids in school, you know, talking about warlike Peleus, or owl-eyed Athene, ox-eyed Hera. And they're also known as the 3 goddesses. So, you know, they get a kick out of this. We talk about it. This was actually a lifesaver to me last year when we were in quarantine and we were asynchronous, because I could post the link to the episode, give them the questions as a Google Doc and check to make sure that they were doing their work. And it gave them something to do. You will also see, if you look in the left-hand margin, they do more than just this. So Return from Troy is the Odyssey. So I do use that. Metamorphosis is something that I haven't used all that much, but basically this is like the early mythology, the stuff that I would teach sixth graders. And again, I relied on it a little bit more last year when we were on quarantine, because it gave me something to give the sixth graders to do. And it was stuff that I was going to cover with them anyway. And oh, and the nice thing about this is, let me go back to War with Troy. If you click on an episode, you could play the whole episode if you want. Or, as I more likely do, well, first of all, they give you a transcript of what they're saying. So if you're trying to create activities or worksheets to go along with this, you don't have to sit and listen through the whole 9-minute podcast. You could just simply scan through quickly. But they also break it up into segments. So sometimes I won't play a whole segment. Like, you know, there's a portion of the Iliad where, you know, where Hera is seducing Zeus to get him to fall asleep so that she can get the Greeks to start winning again. I don't want the 8th graders to hear that. So we kind of skip over that section. It's hard enough in the first section with Peleus Wins a Bride, where it talks about Zeus wanting to pay Thetis one of his little visits. You know, but we kind of gloss over that. All right. So that's my mythology. This next activity is something I picked up at one of those graduate classes I had taken through the Regional Training Center on writing, actually. Writing, it was called Writing Across the Curriculum. And I took it really to try to improve how I could help my seniors write their AP essays. But I ended up getting a lot of activities that actually helped the lower levels. So one of them was this sheet that's called a QAD sheet, question, answer, detail. And I've used it for quite a number of the stories that I have the kids read. So there's a couple of ways that you can approach this. So one is as it's written here. One column has the question. As they're reading through, they just simply writing the answer in English, show me they understand what's going on in the reading. But then the last column, to show that they understand the Latin and are really reading the Latin rather than just kind of faking it, they have to go in and they have to pull out textual support to show me where they got their answer. What this does is it starts training them for what they're going to need to do if they're going to make it all the way through the AP level. You know, if they're going to write something, they need their textual support. So that's one variation of this. Another variation would simply be to try to get the kids more confidence in reading. The first column where it says answer, I'd say, just read through it quickly. If you know you can get the answer to the question, just jot down something. It could be just a word. That's all. Then go back through it a second time, and in the detail column, any additional information that you kind of got the second time because you at least had an idea of where the story was going, put that in there as well. And then I have the kids compare their answers, and between everybody in their group, they generally get a good idea of what's been going on in the stories. Another technique that I've done to try to help kids improve, a variation of this, I should say, is you limit their focus. So the story Murder, if you teach from Ecce, you know it pretty well. If you don't teach from Ecce, they relate the story of a guest at an inn who's murdered by the innkeeper. And so there are two main characters in this. And so what I simply do is I assign each half of the class one of the characters, and I say, your job is to focus on just what your character does. If it's anybody else, you don't have to be interested in what they're doing. So then I limit the questions. So what I will then do is I will put them in groups with people who've had the other character. And I will say to them, go over your answers. And when you're done, together, I want you to write a paragraph in English, which summarizes what went on. And even the struggling kids will at least get the bare bones of what's going on in the story. And I'm hoping it helps build up their confidence. Again, this type of an activity has been really helpful since last March, even into this year, because I really can't give them any experience in translating these stories, because I know they're not going to translate. I know they're going to go right to the internet and pull up all the translations that are on the internet and just copy and paste it. And what have they done? Nothing. At least this way, they have to show me that they've interacted with the text in some way, shape, or form. Any questions on that? All right, and I think this is just about the last activity. I'm see I've gone over a little bit here. One of the things that I'm able to do, particularly in the middle school, because there's all this padding that I have to do, is have the kids write captions. And I find that this is a really fun activity. Again, it gives them exposure to using the dictionary, so they can say anything they want as long as it's school appropriate. And generally, I'll have it focused on the grammar for this particular unit. Oftentimes, I will do it as a PowerPoint, or as part of the PowerPoint that I use to teach with, so they get one picture at a time and they have to write a caption for it. This one was done for a stations activity as a review for the perfect tense. Honestly, I created the station activity, but I never ever used it, because the year after I created this during the summer, we switched to node chairs in my room, which are desks on wheels that can move all around the room. And some of this would involve them having Chromebooks open. And I figured, you know what, if there's a Chromebook on a desk with wheels, it's going to end up on the floor broken. So I abandoned it. But the idea of the captions I've used a number of times. So I find them the oddest pictures that I can find on the internet. Don't even ask me what I search for to get these. All right, but I ask them, I'll show it to them and I'll say, okay, write me a caption on it from the perspective of anybody in the picture. There was one which I eventually ended up taking out just because things are a little bit more sensitive, but it was a little cartoon picture of Ronald McDonald holding up a bank. I thought it was funny. And the kids kind of thought it was funny too, but I figured there's going to be that one sensitive kid that says, he's holding a gun. So, we have, I will then, I'll give them 5-7 minutes to create a caption, and then I'll just randomly call 3 kids to the board and say, okay, write your caption up on the board. And, oftentimes they write the same thing, but, occasionally you have kids who use different vocabulary or use it in a different way. So I think it's valuable. It's also a good activity to do when you have those half days before vacation. You're trying to figure out what to do with them. And let's see. Oh, so, and on a different version, so this is captioning done slightly differently. So at the end of mythology units, and I'll do this in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, I will ask them to draw a picture showing a scene from the stories that we've been learning, and they need to caption it. And sometimes it'll just be they can write whatever they want, as long as it tells me what's in the picture. Other times they have to use a specific piece of grammar. Like right now, after teaching them the introduction to the Trojan War, it ended up meshing with the dative case. So my 8th graders are putting together a 6-panel comic book in which each picture is captioned with a Latin sentence that has to use the dative. And it fits out very nicely because, they'll get, Paris gave the apple to Aphrodite. Eris dropped the apple for the wedding guests. And then, I never, ever grade them on their drawings. Sometimes you get things that are just absolutely beautiful. I mean, there are kids who are great artists, and there are other kids who are just terrible. And I can't say anything, but the only thing I can say to them is no stick figures. You're in 8th grade. You should be well beyond stick figures at this point. So when I grade them, so here's how I would have graded them on this activity in past years. They had to have a perfect tense verb. They also had to use an imperfect tense verb. So it used to be done in December at that time. The rest of the grammar is Latin is grammatically correct. So that absolves me from anything else. I don't have to look too closely. If I see a mistake, they don't get to check for this. The caption is appropriate picture. Is the picture neat and finished? That's all I ask for. And I make a big point of saying, you know, if you're one of these people who like is a heavy hand with the eraser and it's all sorts of smudge marks, or I can see lines of pictures that you changed, I said, that's not neat. You're not going to get credit for it. And then does it depict a scene from the story? So like the introduction in Trojan War, I tell the kids, it can be anything from when the gods resurrect Pelops and he goes off on his adventures up until the sacrifice of Iphigenia. And invariably, you know, you got the kid who has the Greek army storming Troy, or, you know, the guy who has Zeus hurling Tantalus down into the underworld for serving them Pelops stew. I'm like, no, you don't get a check for that because it doesn't fit within that time frame. You got to read your description. All right, and I think that is the end. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. And I will say regarding art, just so the kids don't feel bad, I draw for them on the board, you know, from time to time, and I am terrible. So, you know, they know that. So I said, you know, I'm not the one to be the judge of your art. And there it is, 30 years in a nutshell.
John, thank you so very much. Over the years, we have always, John's given many talks to NJCA, and we've always all taken away a lot of very good things back to our classrooms. So once again, John, I applaud you, as I am sure everybody else does. And thank
Great
you so
work,
much
John.
for doing this.
Thank you.
Let me stop the recording right